Okay, can we start, please? Firstly, welcome to Robert Francis. We did actually, it was Sir Robert Francis on that thing, and then it was premature, so it was taken off, and now it hasn't been put back. So, and Paul Paul at the end there, who's joining us as chairman of the Audit Committee as well. So, welcome to both. Got apologies from Steve Field and Michael Meyer. Steve is actually, I think, lecturing in Harvard or something at the moment. Sounds very erudite. And if anyone's got any declarations of interest, please speak now. No, excellent. Thank you. Minutes. Everyone happy with the minutes? Just the only matter arising was that 3 Lives event on Winterbourne View, which is going to be published later on today. And Lewis, I think you were happy with what you saw on that.
Yes. Yeah. It's fine. And it's a very important. It's a very important step because the event that we held was really quite emotive, and the issue there was whether or not the system would respond to these events properly. It was one thing to have a plan and government concordat. And as we were talking about last night, some of the signs have not been good until now, although I think there's a kind of sense that the programme of work that followed Winterbourne View, the programme on learning disability care, particularly for people with complex needs, that will now be properly addressed. But you know, there's quite a bit of scepticism out there about whether the Winterbourne View will really feed into the system, whether these patients matter enough to the NHS and social care system for it to change the way it works to accommodate them.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. David, your report, please.
Okay. Thanks, David. Good morning, everybody. I suppose the biggest issue that my senior colleagues and I have been dealing with over the past couple of months, in truth, is the issue around appointments, recruitment and workloads. And in paragraph 1 of this report, I've attempted to set out some of the issues which have come through communication across the organisation as a result of the recruitment exercise and the implications that this has got for workload. Put simply, we're attempting and endeavouring this year to recruit an additional 500 people. This is a mixture of inspectors, inspector managers and analysts working in the Strategy and Intelligence Directorate. There is a recruitment process that is underway. That will begin to, appointments are currently being made from that recruitment process of both inspectors and inspection managers. That process completes around the middle of July in this current wave, and appointments and people will start arriving on their contracts from later in the summer, but the process of their arrival will not be completed until the beginning of the autumn, September, October time. And we're offering all new starters 30 days training through the academy in terms of the knowledge and the skills that they will require to undertake the job of inspector and inspection manager. The training's planned. The people to be trained have not yet arrived, and as I say, won't arrive. So new staff will not become, in a sense, productive until we calculate October, and I think we've set this out in the report. The consequence of that is that the volume of work that we need to undertake as an organisation and the additionality of people grappling with new methodologies, new ways of working, means that a number of our staff feel under some considerable pressure in relation to it. And there have been stories of people who've become stressed and anxious and upset as a consequence of that pressure. And that resulted in a note that was to the trade unions, from the trade unions to our Health and Safety Committee, where colleagues had expressed some concern about the intensity of the inspection programme around hospitals that Mike was dealing with the trade unions, being sent to the Health Service Journal. Our response to that was, okay, this isn't something that's secret. We've been talking about this across the organisation. There was nothing new in that story. And our response to that was, to the Health Service Journal, was to acknowledge there was an issue and get on with it, in a sense. And actually, take significantly the fact that people had been expressing their concerns about workload and get on and deal with it. What we've agreed across the executive team that we'll do is we'll begin to target those areas where there are particular pockets of vacancies. So one of the areas is in mental health services, where those teams are seriously under their capacity that we plan them to be. And there'll be a dedicated recruitment programme around mental health, which is designed to address that. And we'll be looking not just at recruiting permanent employees, but secondments of people who are currently in the field. We also know that some teams are pretty much fully staffed. They've got one manager and 8 inspectors, but then there are other places where they've got one manager and 2 inspectors, and therefore they're 6 down and carrying those workloads. So we'll target those areas quite specifically to make a difference to those areas. We're also looking at the commitments that we've made during the year, i.e. the work programme. So as well as trying to speed and accelerate the numbers of staff coming in, we're not going to accelerate the training. We think this needs to be done properly. We've previously been criticised on training, and we're going to hold a line on its 30 days training, not rush that through. But we're also looking at the work that we're expecting people to undertake. So I think Chief Inspectors are working with their senior teams, now they're in place, to look at what offers we can make in relation to focusing on our priority areas, areas of high risk. And actually those areas of least risk, they'll receive less priority for inspection during this coming year. So by the end of the year, we can get into a better balance between the resource that we've got available and the work that is coming through the door. We've tried to set that out to staff in weekly communications. Colleagues will know that I write out to staff every Friday. This issue about the balance between workloads and recruitment, and also the disappointment that some of our staff feel at not being selected for promotional posts in particular, and the fact that they've not received feedback from the recruitment agency has led to me having more emails on this one particular subject than any other subject since I started the job. That includes people's protection and salaries ending, and all the issues about specialisation when we began this journey to where we are today. And I think that gives a signal really of the issues. Later on in this agenda, David, we consider the work on the staff survey and what that tells us. And I think it's fair to say, and we've got a line in here, that I think morale has suffered as a consequence of these issues. I don't think it's inevitable that when you go through a change programme that morale has got to suffer, but the truth is that morale has suffered here. And I think what I'm trying to do in this update is acknowledge that we've listened to and heard the messages from staff that are disappointed under pressure, etc., and that we are taking some action to address those issues. I was concerned about the messages coming back about the recruitment process. Had we set the bar too high? Some of our staff felt it's unfair that internal staff have not had preferential treatment for appointments. So I personally went through every test, every exercise, every guidance note that we've issued, that we've designed around this. And I think this is an industry standard assessment centre for any appointment in either the public sector or the private sector. It's consistent with anything I've personally done or any other job I've had previously overseen as well. I think it's also right that any promotional jobs that we've got are offered simultaneously, internally and externally, and there is no preferential treatment for internal candidates in relation to this. And that's not to devalue internal candidates, which is how some people have experienced it, but to say we're setting a bar for the standard of applicants we want in CQC and the standard of employees that we want. And my sense is that we need to hold a line on that, whilst also offering out some hope to staff who have not succeeded on this particular opportunity that they will get another chance to apply for promotional posts in the future. These are tough messages, they're hard messages, but my view is we need to hold a line on what we've started and continue with that. The second issue sorry, and just to finish, I'll bring to the July meeting the outcome of the Chief Inspector's reviews and then ET's reviews of those 3 plans about how we'll prioritise work and balance the resource, and we'll report that to the to the board meeting in July, David. Second item is the gateway review. Just to note that we had an initial gateway review a few months ago, which was the beginning of our transformation programme. The Audit Committee have overseen this programme, and I think John Harwood, in his last report, when he was chair of the Audit Committee, made a number of recommendations to the board about changes we need to make. A further gateway review will start on the 14th of July, will last for 3 days, and allows some further external scrutiny and challenge of the transformation programme, and again, we'll report that to subsequent meetings of the board when that's complete. It's likely to be the September board meeting, I think, before we'll report that to you. The third item is on Orchid View report. Colleagues will know that we published this report, and I don't want to cut across what Andrea's going to say, and she's got more detail of the report and the issues that we've taken and the action we've taken in her report, which is one of the next agenda items. My purpose including it in this report this morning is not to steal Andrea's thunder, but just to point out, I think it needs to be in the Chief Exec's report because it was a significant issue, and therefore I'm trying to signal that this was an important issue. But the true importance of this was, I think this report now sets a standard for how we as an organisation need to deal with concerns and complaints which are raised. And where we've got something wrong or we feel we've made a mistake, we should carry out a root cause analysis. That should be captured in a report, and that report should come both to the executive team and then to this board, which identifies what happened, what the learning is, and what we intend to do differently. So that's the point I want to pull out in this, and maybe the words in the report kind of mask that really, but it's that important principle of demonstrating our approach to openness. And Camilla, I don't know whether this is an invitation. I understand there might be some things that you want to raise in that spirit of how do we raise issues around openness. So I'm quite happy to pause at this point if you want to use this opportunity. I was filibustering as long as I can so that you could get here. I'd have run out of things to say.
Or you can leave it.
The gateway review. You want to leave it?
Do you want to come back to when you've sort of... Yeah. I mean, the context was on Orchid View. The context was David was saying the way we've handled Orchid View, one of the key things for us is to be open when things have gone wrong, made a mistake, that we're completely open about it. And I thought that was maybe the context you might want to mention your two issues. But you haven't got to.
So, I suppose one of the most useful things that I've found since joining the board has been to try and look at things from the bottom up. And I'm quite lucky that a lot of people write to me, you know, with their own concerns. I mean, there are other people on the table who have the same experience. And I find that really useful because a lot of what we discuss here, I suppose, is high level, very important, but it's quite high level. And I think it's very useful to remind ourselves sometimes of how we deal or don't deal with the people at the bottom, if you know what I mean. So I've had quite a lot of cases that I've tried to follow through, just to where people have come to complain, and tried to see how did we deal with them as an organisation and what's resulted. And there were just two that I thought David thought it might be useful to just talk through very briefly now. And I chose one from social care and one from the NHS because I just thought that would be sort of even-handed. The social care one is much, much simpler. So if I just really briefly, and I'll do it anonymously because that's probably fairer to the people who wrote in. On social care, the CQC did an inspection last May into a care home in Rochdale. We didn't inspect medication because we didn't have any reasons to suspect there was a problem. In July of that year, a man was given a massive dose of the wrong drug and he died. And his son wrote to me because he felt that basically 11 months since that happened, the issues haven't necessarily been resolved. And his son is extremely... A lot of people who write to us all are very reasonable, articulate people. And they actually don't want to make a big fuss. They just want things to be put right. And he's certainly in that category. And one of the things this particular case, I mean, I think it actually is not I think it's probably been resolved now, but one of the things it slightly reminded me of is some of the child protection cases that, you know, David, you'll be familiar with some of those, that sometimes nobody takes responsibility and things sort of go round and round. And one of the points that the son of this man had made to me, he said, this is the kind of situation where there are 3 different organisations and nobody's actually, as he put it, put their foot on the throat of the home, which is a little unfair, but I mean, that's, you know, you get the point. So the man died in July. In December, there was a case conference by the Borough Council to which CQC was not invited. In February, CQC carried out an inspection, and it carried out a further inspection 3 weeks later. It did so apparently unaware that the coroner had issued a Regulation 28 report saying that there was still a problem at the home. And we still haven't quite got to the bottom of why. We did receive the letter, but we don't quite know why it didn't escalate. In that inspection, we found that the home was still not compliant with medication and various other things as well. And in fact, one of the things the son said to me is that the things that we found in that inspection were exactly the same things that he, from a personal perspective, thought were wrong. And that's, you know, quite a long time after the original incident. And we did, in fact, do another inspection on Tuesday. And we were expecting the home at that point to be compliant because they had put an action plan in place. And I think that the son feels that probably things will be resolved. But there's 2 things that struck me about that case, and they're similar to the next one. One is a sort of lack of sense of urgency in some of our response. And the other one, as I said, was that nobody quite grasped who was responsible for what. And there was an awful lot of, the CCG was very good, the coroner was upset that we didn't contact her, so on and so forth. So there are bits of process there. The second case is slightly more complicated. It's an NHS case, which poor David, our chairman, has got very involved in. Because one thing that obviously, as we all know, happens is that if somebody doesn't get the right response the first time, this particular person then became a serial letter writer. And I think at that point, probably the organisation may have thought, oh, you know, we're not sure that this person is actually serious. Of course, in fact, they were serious. It's just that they became more and more and more frustrated with the system. This man's mother died, sadly, he believes, of failures in her original treatment at a social enterprise, which led to her being admitted to the Great Western Hospital last year. And he raised a number of different issues. One was that he said her medical records were inadequate. One was he said he had made a whole series of complaints that had not been, the hospital hadn't responded to at all. He wrote 5 letters to the Chief Executive of Great Western, which were not responded to. And he also slightly complicated the issue by saying he had another friend who had died of C. diff at the hospital. So, of course, the letter which arrived, or there's several letters which arrived, were quite a jumble of complaints. And this organisation dealt with them, I understand, by sort of trying to separate bits out and sending them off to different people. And essentially what we failed to do was to give him any response that was specific. So to cut an extremely long story short, as David knows, and David wrote some of these responses, which, you know, they got better and better as time went on. We essentially gave him general responses where we should have given specifics every single time. And when I intervened, and this was 7 months after he originally came to me, and I must say that every single time that I have contacted the organisation has been brilliant in responding to me and trying to get to the bottom of these things. But the organisation's first response to me was to create a suggested response, which included the sort of phrase that suggested that CQC has taken your concerns very seriously. Now, I wasn't going to sign that letter because it obviously wasn't true. So the organisation's first response was to say, and to offer him a meeting. And in both these 2 cases, our first response was to offer a meeting, which is right. I mean, it's an open and transparent approach, but without having actually dug down to get the full facts. Now, by the time the GWH case had reached David's desk, I mean, the number of people, by the time I got involved, the number of people in this organisation who ended up being involved was huge. The amount of our time, the amount of energy that it took was enormous. I then went through all the paperwork, all of his letters and all of our letters, which were very difficult to collate because this organisation did not actually have, for quite a while, all of that to hand. It clearly wasn't in one filing cabinet. and a lot of people helped, and they were very good about helping, but it wasn't to hand. And I pinpointed the 4 questions that I thought he was asking. And none of those questions had been pinpointed. You know, we hadn't done that exercise. I then looked at what we had done about the 4 questions, and actually I'm afraid to say in each case we hadn't really, we'd sent a lot of paper around the system, but we hadn't necessarily got traction with questions. And what we hadn't done was, critically, was to tell Mike's team, who were inspecting the hospital, about the issues. And Mike would obviously have made a judgment about how seriously to take those issues, but he wasn't informed, which, you know, it doesn't quite gel with our sense of intelligence, wanting to gather intelligence. So, I mean, I don't want to sort of prolong this, because obviously, you know, one could talk about it forever, but I think there's a couple of sort of things that it raises, and I don't want to say these are typical either, because I get quite a few of these, but, you know, I don't think this is necessarily typical, but I do think that it raises just a couple of issues about the way we respond. One is tone. One of the, I mean, almost, well, not so tragic, it would almost be hilarious that the letter that the second man received from NHS England said that it couldn't deal with his complaint because it only dealt with primary care, which was just astonishing. So some of the letters that are generally in the system are surprising. We have, I think, we've got to change our language. I don't think that we can always, we can't obviously give individual people always an absolute resolution of their issue, but I think we need to get slightly better at connecting with what they actually want. Most of these people want to know that what happened to their relative is not going to happen again. And we tend to give slightly bland reassurance, which is not always convincing. I also just think that sometimes, and you know, David, you'll know better than I mean, I don't know whether we need to change our process, but we need to sometimes get just a little bit better about deciding where in the system this has traction. So on this guy, I mean, one of his complaints about the social enterprise, it went to NCSC, it went to the safeguarding team, it went to the inspector, which was completely the right process. The inspector didn't do anything about it and has left no notes of what they did about it. So that should have, at some point, triggered an alarm bell in the system. So it wasn't that we did the wrong thing, it's just that at some point it disappeared. And we need to be, I think we also maybe need to deal with this issue that Paul's raised before, which is whether or not we investigate individual complaints. So, of course, you know, we say we don't investigate individual complaints. It's a very tricky line, as we all know, because, of course, we need the intelligence from individual complaints to feed into our inspection process. We can't take an individual complaint to its end conclusion, and we do sometimes say to people, well, you need to go to the Ombudsman. But it seems to me from looking at our correspondence that we're very quick to tell people to go to the Ombudsman. It's one of our standard paragraphs. And people misunderstand that. I mean, they misinterpret it, and they think, well, actually, in this case, probably correctly, you're not doing anything about it. So I wonder if there's just a bit of a case for going back over that. And that's all I really want to say there here, because I think, you know, there are sort of 3 things at stake, really. One is our reputation, obviously. One is the genuine issue of intelligence gathering, that if the intelligence isn't getting to Mike's team in this case, it doesn't help. And he was actually doing a cleanliness inspection at the time when this guy was complaining about infection control. And the other one is just our own time. It's not efficient. So, in fact, I think being slightly smarter about this would probably save us time and money. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I think it was good. I wanted Camilla to raise it, you know, at a public meeting, because, you know, I think it does bring home. And actually, I have to say, when I get complaints, sort of difficult complaints, and 3 or 4 letters and stuff, your heart sort of sinks. But it shouldn't sink, because actually, for that person who's writing in, the failure of the system is 100%. So, Camilla, thanks for that. And we'll take that on board.
So I think this is like reliving the Health Select Committee yesterday all over again. And part of our narrative, I think, so under Michael, at the committee that Michael chairs, we are reviewing our internal processes for complaints. So I think you've used those cases really well, Camilla, to fillet out some of the issues around tone the connection with the intelligence gathering and feeding that in, and the issue about time efficiency in relation to this. So I think all of those will be recognised, but I think what we need to do, David, is take it away from this meeting and make sure it feeds into those processes. I do think this issue, and you're right where you began, I think, Camilla, which is, I think with lots of us in health and care think in generalities about what is it we're doing, but people live this in specifics and in the detail of this, and somehow we need to make sure we're constantly making that connection between the generalities and the specifics. But I think we should take it on. Similar issues around whistleblowing, about does every whistleblowing investigation and does that connect with the inspection plan, or are they informing the key lines of inquiry? So as we take these systems into maturity, we need to make sure that they're actually both efficient, but actually they're making those connections as well. So one of our previous responses in relation to whistleblowing cases, we've now made it mandatory that all inquiries into the National Customer Services Centre should actually be signed off by an inspector on the customer relationship database. So there shouldn't be anything that looks like it's lost. It's just an example of that. So I think we need to just take this away and actually make sure those disciplines are in place as we actually move forward with the work that we're doing. So I think these are good and important points.
Okay.
Yep. A couple of points. I mean, I think it would be useful to think about all the kind of points where people touch our organisation, whether it's sort of members of the public or others, particularly when they're telling us stuff or wanting information. So I think, looking at it from that perspective would be quite good. But the other thing also is about expectations. People often do find it very hard that we want to know about what their complaint, if you like, but then we don't investigate all the individual circumstances. And we will have to be very careful not to raise expectations, because that has happened on a number of occasions. And we really do need to be careful with it. We definitely need to be responsive and clear and get everything, get our processes right. But if you've lost a child and you think that CQC is going to give you the answers you want, then, and we kind of let them believe that for a while before saying we're not going to, it's pretty devastating. I mean, that's an extreme end of it, but it's also being, quite clear about what our role is, as well as sort of being responsive. Yeah.
Well, I agree with that. It's very interesting, these cases, because I think the issues that you're raising, Camilla, are quite broad issues as well as specific about these cases. Of course, we can't do everything, but it should be possible when members of the public take a concern to us for them to be on to the next stage as a result of our action. And the difficulty that you're describing is that when we say, well, we're interested in complaints, incidentally, we do investigate some complaints, don't we, under the Mental Health Act. So there's a greater anomaly that we'll investigate some but not others. But the real sort of sting in the reply to the public is you've got to start again. It isn't just that we're the wrong organisation, but it doesn't. It would be much better if we were the route through which that complaint went to the ombudsman or went to some other body. It does sound when you say when we say that that's not our role, that people are being pushed back to square one. And for people who are distressed and or have a grievance, that's a poor response. However we might intend it. The second issue is the starting point for your first case, which is about medicines management in care homes, and I do think this is a really important question for us. So, none of those things would have happened if medicines management in a care home was good. So let's not lose sight of the fact this was not just about internal processes. This was actually about what happened at an interface between two elements of the service. So this is back to the issue of how we integrate two bits of the service. When I went on a sort of induction inspection, I went to a care home and I thought it wasn't a bad care home, and I thought the inspector did really well. But the main issues, looking through a lot of the records, were about the medication that was being used, which seemed to be excessive and duplicating functions. So the trouble was the inspector wasn't expert on medication. Why should there be? They were a social care inspector. The person in charge of the care home knew nothing about medication except when they were supposed to give it, because that was prescribed by a local GP. So one of the key elements of activity and safety at that care home wasn't even examined, because we didn't have the ability to do it, and they didn't have the ability to respond, even if we'd wanted to do it. So this question of how we integrate, how we look at our function from the point of view of the person who's receiving care, and not through the individual providers, is going to come back at us until we're able to resolve it. We haven't got a person-centred inspection system, and yet we're expecting a person-centred care system.
So, I mean, Take has read the work that we're doing on our internal complaints processes, though I think it's taken quite a long time for us to get to the point of progressing that. So it'd be great to kind of be able to get to the end of that piece of work. But I think there's I mean, I thought that was really interesting and really helpful, and rang many bells. And I mean, at Healthwatch England, we get a surprising number actually of people who come to us because they've got desperate. Because actually, there's nothing that Healthwatch England can do either in these spaces. So there are people who have just been floating around the system, passed from pillar to post, who've reached that level of frustration, which makes people more inclined actually to dismiss them, because it's stopped being what you might describe as rational. It's not at all. It's a perfectly rational response to a completely irrational situation, and they just feel like they've been pushed around the spin dryer endlessly. So I don't think we will be able. We could have a great process for handling all of this internally and feeding it into our inspection processes and so on. But we will not resolve this question of what happens with people the issue of not being able to investigate, not being the right place actually to investigate complaints at that level of individual detail and giving them a response on the individual detail, unless we sort of orchestrate more of a system-wide conversation about how that happens. Because I'm not sure I agree, Lewis, that it would be better if the CQC investigated those more complaints. I'm not sure the CQC is the right place for that to happen.
I said they should be you shouldn't have to then go to somebody else.
No, I understood, but I don't think that the system as a whole has resolved who they think is the right place. So there was a piece of work which was done in the context of Clwyd Hart, and then responses in Hard Truths on complaints. And what actually, to be truthful, what there is in Hard Truths is a set of activities around complaints. So it's a kind of patchwork of bits of work. But none of these truly address the question of how do we manage the fact that individual complainants are finding their way sometimes to NHSE, sometimes to CQC, sometimes to Healthwatch England, sometimes to PHSO or the LGO, I mean, all over the place. And it's not really surprising. I mean, we did a map of how many players there are in the health and social care complaints system, and there's more than 75 organisations or types of organisation. That doesn't account for the fact that there's 148, 150 of various different kinds of organisations. These are types of organisations who have a role to play in complaints. So it's incredibly complicated, and it absolutely is not clear where we should be telling people or where we should be sending people to, actually, or, even if we act as a portal and support their kind of being passed to an appropriate person, it isn't clear to everyone how that should happen. And arguably, there's a really kind of quite simple bit, which is you start with the provider. If you don't get what you want, you go to the Ombudsman. But it isn't quite like that. It's more complicated than that. We would argue at Healthwatch that what you need is a really good advocacy service, and actually the person that you ought to pass people to is, or help people to get to, is someone who can help them through the system, so someone who guides and supports them and acts on their behalf. But that advocacy service, such as it is at the moment, is very fragmented. It's different in health and social care, it's different in mental health, and it's different in children for children. So that in itself is not a good quality of highly visible service to support people through complaints. So I mean, that is to say that I think there's a really big question which the system as a whole hasn't resolved, and which I would really like to see the CQC playing a part in getting an answer to. Not that we should be the answer, but that there needs to be an answer to some of those kind of more fundamental questions about how the system as a whole deals with complaints.
Thank you. Just 2 or 3 points, and Diane may want to pick up on this more directly. But one of the things that we have announced recently is the agreement between ourselves and the local government ombudsman and the Parliamentary and Health Service ombudsman, that if calls come through to us, which really ought to be going to them, and vice versa, that actually we make those direct transfers without actually saying no, put the phone down and ring somebody else up. And so we are trying to facilitate a better service and response to people who, as Anna quite rightly says, kind of get into the system at different points, and that may not be the right bit of the system. The second thing I think that I just wanted to say was that to go back to, I think, one of the comments that Camilla made right early on, which is that very often when things go wrong, people want to make sure that it doesn't happen to other people, so that the system learns from it and actually makes a difference. And that's where our role, I think, we can be very clear and explicit, can be, because in actually taking regulatory action, either through inspection or however else we do it, we ought to be putting into the system the signposts really that can help to make those changes, so that the broader issues get addressed, even if we're not resolving the specific issue for an individual. So that makes it even more important for the third point that I wanted to make, which is that our own intelligent monitoring, but also management and assessment of risk, kind of works really, really well, and that's one of the issues, both through the changes that we're making through the structures within the organisation to enable much better support for our inspectors and our inspection teams, and also from Paul's team in intelligence, to make sure that we're actually using the information better to flag those things up and to flag up the risks. And we're not completely there yet, and thank Camilla and others for raising some of these issues with us, because each and every time we can make incremental differences to make it better, and that's very helpful. But that's kind of one of the areas, particularly in adult social care, that we're really focusing on, is how are we managing our risk registers so that people are generally aware of this and responding properly, and making sure that all of those dots join up. Because certainly in the example Camilla's given, we did not join up the dots as well as we could have done.
One other question, then I'll let Camilla have the last word on this. Paul, I think, was put his hand. Paul, and then Camilla.
So we've talked quite a lot about the operational changes that we will make and are starting to make, and also the changes that are really about the service we deliver to people who contact us and raise concerns of customers, and customers having quite the right wording, but it's more around that mindset. But we've also got the opportunity on the policy side. David's mentioned the key lines of inquiry that we're changing to be more responsive to people who raise concerns. But with the new regulations coming in to play, presumably from October, around fundamental standards, we've got an opportunity, and we'll consult on our enforcement policy very shortly, to look at the conditions under which we will explore, or to use the right phrase, what has happened to an individual. If an individual has suffered degrading treatment, we can absolutely prosecute. That's the purpose of the new regulations and the move away from essential standards to fundamental standards. So I think that's a tangible change, which may or may not give total recourse to the individual, depends what they were after, and circumstances are different, but that ability to hold providers to account for individual failings of care as well as systematic ones, I think is quite important.
Just one last point that strikes me, actually, as a result of this conversation. We are fundamentally a safety organisation. we're not a complaints organisation. You know, we need to deal properly with complaints. But I do wonder, suddenly strikes me that we're quite good on, I suspect that it's a slight cultural thing, we're quite good on, if we think it's a safety issue, you know, we go out there and we look at it and we inspect it and we kind of try to get a grip of it. I just wonder whether we need to be a bit careful that we don't think of some things as complaints and other things as safety, because actually the two cases I've given are really about safety. And what I think I was trying to say was that sometimes our response as an organisation to what we see as complaints is somewhat defensive, and our desire is to just sort of make sure the person's happy and smooth it all over, rather than actually get to the safety issue. You know what I mean? So I don't think we need to keep that in mind when we're kind of dealing with our complaints process. We don't put it in a kind of separate box.
And James Titcombe made that point in the Select Committee yesterday about in the nuclear industry, they actually deal with that as feedback about safety issues, not as a complaint to be made. So it's a powerful resonance with that. Can I just, not to have the last word, David, but there's one of our managers called Caroline Jenkinson who's been dealing with a father whose daughter had an eating disorder who died. And I have to say she's been dealing with him over about 9 months. And I think it's a brilliant piece of humane work. So your point about what's typical and what isn't typical, not to deny those stories, which are also true. But I see lots of people now, and a lot of our letters to MPs, we've left behind this cold style that we've had, and they'll have the inspector or the inspection manager dealing with this is their name goes in, their email address and their mobile telephone. So that gives the MP and indeed some constituents the opportunity to go back to people, and I think that is a significant advance on what we've got. I think what the stories pull out is a huge variation that we've got across the organisation about this, and that I think is a challenge, and I'm absolutely with Paul, that will do it. And I think on the systems-wide stuff, we are part of the DH group overseeing this, and I think it's for the DH not to start dumping responsibility, but if they're holding the line on the framework, then we may need to make a contribution. So we are represented at a senior level. Malta Gerhold, as Director of Strategy, attends that group for that very specific opportunity. Item 4 is a Crown Prosecution Service. I wrote in here the board will recall, and I strongly suspect the board will not recall, because I don't know there's anybody on the board apart from Kay that was that goes back, well, it's even before my time is this, I think, as well. So there was a case where an inspector had been found to have actually been involved in corruption. They'd been accepting money in return for guarantee inspection outcomes to a provider. That was identified internally by staff, and it was referred to the police. The police investigated. It went to the Crown Prosecution Service, who took a decision not to prosecute because they deemed it not to be in the public interest. John Harwood was incredibly concerned, and I think you were as well, Kay, in relation to this. And there were a sequence of letters that went to the CPS in relation to this over about a 12-month period, raising our concern at the judgment of the CPS that this was not in the public interest. I think our view was this was absolutely in the public interest and a prosecution should have resulted. As a consequence of the last letter that we sent, Rebecca and myself met with a senior colleague from the Crown Prosecution Service who was now in a different job, but prior to that had been in the Special Investigations branch, who'd reviewed all the correspondence and the paperwork in relation to this particular case, and who did say that that decision not to prosecute was wrong. He accepted that it was in the public interest to prosecute, apologised to us for not doing that, and we then had a conversation which Rebecca's been taking forward about what's the relationship that we need both with the local police in relation to these cases. Historically, we've had a relationship with the City of London because that's where we sit, and I think the outcome of this is we'll develop a relationship with a Met role in the City of London, and also setting up a relationship with the Crown Prosecution Service, so we've got a more direct line of communication and contact with them as a consequence of that. Because this has been a big issue over a number of well, I think now over a number of years, I wanted just to draw the board's attention to that and say that Rebecca and other colleagues will work on how we can develop that. And then the last item, Chair, is a 3 Lives report that you and Lewis have, if I'm not stealing Andrea's thunder, have already stolen my thunder on this and said this report is being published today. It's a story of 3 individual lives and sets out some of the issues that are done. The report that is published does have actions which are being taken and they're designed to make improvements and a contribution across the system in the way that the learning should be extracted from those 3 cases and taken forward. But I'll leave that there. Thanks, Chair.
Good. Thanks very much, David. Look, Paul Elliott and Karen Hack are here for the next but one item. So can we take the reports from the Chief Inspectors as read and just ask questions on it rather than going through them in great detail, unless there's any particular issues that Andrew or Mike wanted to pull out of them?
I'm very happy
Okay.
to have mine taken as read, Chair. I'm very happy also to answer any questions.
Andrew, do you want to bring anything out or not?
Thank
Any questions for Mike?
Andrew, on the covert surveillance, which obviously is becoming quite a big issue with very polarised views on it, and I just wanted to sort of clarify, what we can actually do as an organisation, because we in legislation we can do covert surveillance. Is that right? And there's a code of practice, and all, so that would have to be sort of instigated if we did go down that line. Is that right? And also just where are we on that issue, the covert surveillance?
Thank you very much, Kate. There's 2 aspects to the covert surveillance question. One, what can the Care Quality Commission do? And secondly, what generally happens and what advice and guidance should we be giving to the industry? And as we've highlighted in the report, there is a range of views about this, which are both polarised in some respects, but also lots of shades of grey in between. So where I think we plan to get to is reviewing all of the feedback that we've had through consultation, the roundtable that we had with a number of different stakeholders. There's another event that the Relatives and Residents Association are going to organise in July as well, which will bring together another round of discussion of interested people in this subject. Looking at our powers, we do indeed have those powers already, and we are working through what are the circumstances where it might be appropriate, and being very clear and explicit with ourselves about that. We've got a workshop with inspectors later on this month to kind of talk through the practicalities of all of this, because there's no point us coming up with a policy position which actually makes no real sense on the ground. So we'll probably come out with something but at the stage where we're issuing the provider handbooks that do that. And the second issue, the social care providers are very interested in what our view is of covert surveillance in terms of how they might use it. And again, I think that although there are different positions, the consensus seems to be emerging around if there are specific issues of potential harm, either through abuse or neglect, that actually, this is the only way that you'd be able to find it out, then those circumstances, it may well be appropriate. But there needs to be very careful consideration of people's dignity, privacy, their capacity to consent, all of those sorts of things. And so our plan is to work through with others, including the Commissioner, around some form of a guidance note around that. And again, we'd look to doing that later on in the year. So it's still work in progress, but that's what we're doing.
Sorry, just a question also for you, Andrea, on the registration process. So there's a reference in the report to using experts by experience in that process. I wonder if you could just elaborate on how that might work?
So we're piloting that at the moment, Anna, and looking at part and parcel of our approach to the regulation and inspection of all of our services starts with a rigorous and robust test at registration, and ensuring that we're actually applying the same level of rigour to registration inspection visits as we are to inspections of services once they're up and running. We're interested to find out what additional value experts by experience can add to that, both in the questions that they might be able to ask and the sort of assessment of the application for registration. And that's working through at the moment. And again, it's more work in progress. There's lots of things going on, but we will be evaluating how that does work and whether it's appropriate to roll that out. We have been using experts by experience in the registration of services for people with learning disabilities as part of our response to what's been happening on Winterbourne View, and indeed the other cases that our Three Lives report highlights. So we've got some experience, but we're trying to develop it further.
Andrea, could I just ask a question about Orchid View? Since we last met, our report's been published. The local report into the serious case review has been published. I must say I was struck by the response of the families in the media, the families who were affected, the people whose relatives died, because they went further and said that what they wanted was a public inquiry. Now, we live in an era where people want public inquiries, and it's a common request. But I think we've got to try to understand what it was they were saying when they said that, and it suggests a kind of dissatisfaction with the process, as if there's a sense that there's something fundamentally wrong with how care homes are operating for some people, and that even an investigation that has been the one that's been done in Orchid View doesn't quite get to the bottom of it. I think when people say, we need a public inquiry to investigate that, what they really mean is that there's something behind all of this which we're not quite getting to, and therefore we don't have the confidence that the fundamental problems are going to be addressed, because we're not sure they've been identified. Now, whether that's something to do with the sort of financing of care homes that we were talking about at a meeting last night, whether it's about the training of staff, whether it's just about the way that families are listened to, but essentially, I think they were saying something quite important about their confidence that the fundamental difficulties of care homes are being properly addressed. And you can see what they mean. If you look at the local review, I thought our review in the end was very good. But if you look at what the local review said, it was a very sensible review. But what it called for was named staff, for contact details, for better CPD, for guidance. And when relatives have died, these sound like quite small measures compared to the enormity of what's happened. And so you can understand why the families are saying, isn't there something more fundamental that has to happen here? And how do we have the confidence that it will take place? Now, what can we do about that? One thing we could do is formally review whether change has happened in our own systems, but also in some of the other recommendations from the report into Orchid View. No, I don't know if we have a plan to report back at a certain point as to what is different in, let's say, I don't know, 4 months, 6 months. So what is different as a result of Orchid View, and to bring that back to this board.
Thank you. So a few things kind of come out of that, Lewis. And I think that the first and foremost thing to say is that the experience of the families was awful, and both at the time and subsequently, in terms of understanding that some of the concerns that they'd had at the time and they'd expressed at the time were indeed right, and neglect had contributed to 5 of those deaths, and other people had died having had very poor and unacceptable levels of care. So I think that the anguish with which they've obviously had to live was coming through last week, and we've certainly made contact with the families. Adrian Hughes, Deputy Chief Inspector for that area, has met with them. We will do that again. So I think that in terms of responding to them as individuals, having had an awful experience, I think it's very important that we respond to that with the humanity that deserves, rather than kind of just, as we were just discussing before, hiding behind the bureaucracy of our realm.
I told you that, Andrea. I mean, Robert, it'd be interesting to get your perspective on this. And what Lewis is saying sort of resonates, I think. It certainly resonated with me, that people feel that the system is just not addressing the fundamental problems that's affecting these people.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, there is obviously a tendency to demand a public inquiry for everything, but I think that Lewis has a really good point. One thing I would add is that I think a lot of the time people feel that those who should be held to account are getting away with it in a way through the sort of, I'm not saying they are or not, but that's the feeling. And of course, unfortunately, they're often a little bit misguided in feeling that a public inquiry is going to do any better in that particular regard, because there are other processes through which that needs to happen. But also maybe there's a feeling that the enormity of what they have suffered is not being properly recognised in public. And it's a public element which is not satisfied by what goes on behind closed doors in a review and so on. They don't actually see, and it's all people judging themselves. That's the other issue they tend to look at. Although, obviously, in these safeguarding cases, there is an independent element in what happened. And I think also they don't quite understand the process. So there are all those things gathered up in it. But I think principally, I would say it's the recognition to them and the public in general of the wrong that's been done, and the feeling that no one's been held to account are two powerful drivers towards a demand for a public inquiry. Although in both instances, there almost invariably, in my view, would be, unless it's a real national issue, better ways of dealing with it.
And just to answer the specific points from Lewis, on Orchid View, in terms of the recommendations of the serious case review, there are some recommendations that are made for us, the vast majority of which are kind of already incorporated in our own internal review and action that we have taken or are already taken. There's a couple where I think we've got to do a little bit more thinking through as to how we apply that to the world that we're now in, as opposed to the world that we were in 2011. So my plan was to bring that back to the board and to be absolutely clear and explicit what we're doing in response to those recommendations. But to take the broader point, I think that one of the things that we can do as the CQC is use the state of care report when we do that in a really meaningful way, because we do, I mean, we have the most amazing insight into what is happening in both the adult social care sector and the other sectors that we regulate, which we report on through the state of care report. And I think that that's the place where actually some of these broader kind of more national issues can be drawn out and highlighted, and that's certainly the intention that we've got as to how we would use the state of care report this year, is to kind of use that to identify some of those things, and that I think is a very powerful way for us to be sharing the broader learning that we can have from the work that we do.
It's the last question, and make it quick.
I'm really sorry. It's just a reflection on what Robert was saying, which I think is really important. That part of the reason why people call for a public inquiry is because they want to be able to give public account of their experience in a way that they don't in a private review. And so I just wonder if there isn't something that we could and should be doing in terms of our own review process, which includes an element of having that kind of a hearing of what people want to tell us, but doing it in a public environment, however we do the rest of the review. But that then takes me to a slightly other thought, which is perhaps there's a conversation that would be useful to have with the families at Orchid View about what would have made the difference for them in the way that the serious case review was carried out, and made them feel that they didn't need to call for something else, because maybe they will have some kind of quite concrete ideas about things that they would have liked to have happened, or the way they would have liked it to have happened, which we could then build into our process going forward.
Which is fine, but I think that we do have to remember where the responsibility for both commissioning the serious case review is, and it's with the Adult Safeguarding Board for the area, and certainly again they've had a lot of interaction and liaison with the with the families, and I know that that they're intending to continue with that. I think that the thing that we certainly need to do, and it came out loud and clear from the families, is think about what would have made it better for them in relation to the interaction with CQC. And absolutely clearly, and it goes back to the conversation that we had earlier, it's about listening to what they're saying and responding and taking that into consideration in the action that we take through regulation and inspection. And that's one of the areas that we have control in terms of how we do it and what we should do, and is absolutely built into the approach that we're taking as we're going forward.
Andrea in her report says we'll bring back a report to the July board of the actions to follow up on the serious case review. And I wonder whether we should add to that the Care Act and the powers that are introduced by the Care Act that play to this point. So there are two things that come out. One is that now adult safeguarding boards are put on a statutory footing. And this is Andrea's point. They are the mechanism to actually take this forward. The second one is I think one of the tools that the Care Act introduced is a fit and proper person. The area which I live gets the regional television, so I got all the interviews with the families on the regional news when the Orchid View report was. And I think Robert's point is what I heard the families say was that they wanted somebody to be held to account for it, and that was a very powerful message through the interviews, albeit edited, that came through. The difficulty on this, with it being a Southern Cross home, as we've said, is those people no longer exist because Southern Cross is not quite gone as a legal entity, I understand, but is virtually gone. But the fit and proper person test allows any of those people that were in those senior positions in Southern Cross, the boards that they're currently working within, the chair of that board, to take a view on whether, in light of what happened at Southern Cross, they are indeed fit and proper people. So I think one of the issues, and we need to work out how we're going to take that forward and what that means in terms of our powers. So one of the themes that we talked about at the dinner yesterday evening was how proactive or reactive we're going to be with some of these new powers. So I think part of the bigger debate, I think, that comes out of this is how is the Care Act going to be used and how we take that forward, and whether, I think, collectively as a board we understand what has been provided to us by the Care Act and the detail of the Care Act. And I think there's a bigger piece of work that we need to do about, do we understand the full implications of the Care Act and what tools it might give us, whether the people will regard them as being adequate or otherwise. They are tools we've been given, and we need to actually work out how we're going to use them. So I think what we need to do, I'm looking at Paul as well as Andy in this, is when we bring this back to actually open up a bigger conversation about how the tools in the Care Act need to be used. And I think that needs to be not just a board level discussion, but it needs to be a discussion that takes place with managers, inspection managers, inspectors as well as we go through. And this is one of the issues we would have taken forward through the academy, but it's one way of picking up on this issue about what are we doing about it, I think is your question, Anna, and what is it legitimate we do about it. I think there's lots of things that are legitimate that we need to do about it to follow it through. But some of those are new to us. I think, what the fit and proper person test means and how that's applied. And people will say it doesn't go far enough, but Parliament has now said that's the tool we're giving you, make it work. So we actually need to work out how that's going to work, it strikes me, rather than say, well, it doesn't do everything that people want. Well, that might be true, but actually we've got it and we need to use it. Not in 12 months' time, be sat in conversations at a Health Select Committee or elsewhere saying, we gave you this tool, why have you not used it? So I think we need to proactively pick that up, and it's just to connect the finer detail from this report with, I think, some of the things that we need to do.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Andrea. Next item is on the Mental Health Act. Mike, you're going to introduce this.
I'll introduce my colleagues, if I may, and then hand over to them. Paul Elliott, who I think almost everybody on the board will know, is Deputy Chief Inspector in the Hospitals Directorate, but leads on mental health, and Caroline Hacker, but beyond him, is relatively newly appointed Head of Mental Health Policy. But can I also introduce two others who are there as well, Pauline Carpenter, who leads on Mental Health Act operational issues, and Simon Wood, who leads on SOAD. So I think we have a good team here to talk about what we need to talk about.
And if you want to contribute, you haven't got a mic, so just come down towards where Paul is and don't be reticent there.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm going to speak just for a couple of minutes to the paper and then obviously invite questions and discussion. As well as being the regulator for health and social care providers in England, the Care Quality Commission also has duties under the Mental Health Act and also as part of the UK's National Preventative Mechanism under the United Nations Optional Protocol to the Convention Against Torture. I'll refer to that as OPCAT going forward. We've continued to discharge these responsibilities during a time when we focused much of our attention on developing the new approach to inspection. I think, though, that now that we're nearing the end of the development phase of the new approach, it's perhaps a good time to both take stock of how we're discharging our responsibilities under the Mental Health Act and OPCAT, but also to review the extent to which we can integrate these duties with our work to inspect health and social care services. And what we're putting before the board is a proposal to establish a board to oversee the work. Just to say a few words about the responsibilities that we have. The CQC acquired our responsibilities under the Mental Health Act in 2009 when they were transferred from the Mental Health Act Commission. And we discharge these responsibilities through two principal routes. Firstly, through our Mental Health Act commissioners, who each year visit about 1,300 wards in which people are detained. And as well as making visits to wards and talking to patients who are detained, we are also responsible for reviewing complaints relating to the application of the Act. And we also receive notifications of deaths of detained patients. The second principal way in which we discharge our duties are through the second opinion appointed doctor service, and I'll refer to that as SOAD going forward. And this comprises about 120 consultant psychiatrists who make about 12,000 visits to places where patients are detained under the Mental Health Act. And their job is to provide a second opinion about treatments given under the Act. We're also responsible for producing the annual report about the use of the Act, and we're also expected to advise the Department of Health on any changes to the Code of Practice to the Mental Health Act. Now, our role as part of the National Preventative Mechanism under OPCAT, we're expected to make regular unannounced visits to places where people are or may be detained on the grounds of mental disorder. Now, this does include locations that are registered for the Mental Health Act, so it is mental health wards, but it also includes places of de facto detention, which extends that responsibility to care homes and to all NHS and independent sector hospitals, both mental health and acute. And these are places that may use deprivation of liberty safeguards under the Mental Capacity Act. Now, we consider that we discharge our responsibilities under OPCAT through our Mental Health Act monitoring activities and through our programme of inspections. What we're proposing, in summary, is firstly to, 4 years after or 5 years after we took on these responsibilities, to determine how effective we are in discharging our responsibilities under the Mental Health Act. We want to develop and then implement a plan for integrating our Mental Health Act functions with our new approach to inspection. And we want to do this as far as possible without adversely affecting the discharge of our duties under the Mental Health Act. During that work, we'll identify any duties under the Act that we cannot fully integrate and ensure that these are discharged optimally. And finally, I think we want to continue to develop clear policies and processes about how we deliver our OPCAT responsibilities. And as I say, we believe that this is being done through our Mental Health Act monitoring work and our inspections. What we are presenting is a timetable for the work. The timetable or the timeline aligns with the implementation of the new Mental Health Act Code of Practice in April 2015. And as well as the proposed work, we would continue to work closely with those at the department who are revising the Code of Practice. That's really all I want to say, and obviously happy to answer any questions.
Thanks very much, Paul. Caroline, did you want to add anything?
That's
No?
fine, that's fine.
Okay. Questions for Paul? Okay.
I actually don't have questions, really. It's just some sort of comments. I mean, I'm obviously very pleased that this paper has come to the board, and it shows that we're taking the issue seriously. I think my overriding message is that we need to sort of get on with it, frankly, and obviously we need to do it properly. And I just need sort of assurance that it's doable in the time scale. So it would be good to have that assurance. And I suppose it would be good to know, what the final model is likely to be, because I'm aware that quite a lot of work has been done over the years, and I'm not actually sure where all that's gone, to be honest, and whether any of it is currently relevant. So it would be quite good, to have a kind of clear model as soon as possible. And the only things I would say is that, I agree that the Mental Health Act functions do need to be integrated, but we do need to make sure that we maintain the focus on the Mental Health Act and that we don't dilute it. And I'm pretty sure we've got people that will make sure that doesn't happen, but I would sort of firmly endorse that view. I mean, that doesn't mean that we have to do it in the same way that we've always done it. I think we can be quite creative if we want to be, and I'm sure people have ideas, because there has been a tendency, particularly to focus on wards and inpatient units, partly because that's what's always happened and partly because it's easier. And I know we've done other bits and pieces, but there's obviously, it's not just about the inpatient, it's about approved Mental Health Act social workers and Section 12 doctors and Section 136. So it would be good that when we're doing our monitoring that we do actually look at a kind of pathway approach as well. So thank you. I mean, I very keen to get on with it, and also to kind of, as soon as possible, get a clear kind of idea of what the eventual model will be. Yeah, thank you.
That, Paul.
Yes, I can respond briefly. I think that I absolutely share your view that we have to give very close attention to our responsibilities under the Act. I think since I've been in post, I've not noticed there's been any lessening of effort and vigour in that regard, but there is always a risk given our huge focus on the inspections. And thank you very much for expressing your confidence in the people involved. I share that. I think we have the staff in place to see it through. And we're also going to ensure that there'll be a senior person within the hospital's directorate who takes a lead on the Mental Health Act, so the focus is maintained.
Again, this is more of a comment, partly because it's been a feature of this that we've been able, Kay and I have been able to work with the mental health team very well. So they've consulted and come for comment and advice, which is a very helpful part of the way this is working. But can I just emphasise a couple of things that I think will be vital in how we review our function under the Mental Health Act. There's a sense that we haven't been very good in the past of getting the right information. Information is king in this area, amongst many others. And we don't have very good information on when people die under the Mental Health Act and why. And yet there are about 300 deaths a year under the Mental Health Act. Most of them are natural cause deaths, but that doesn't mean they don't include preventive factors which could be addressed by better care. And getting information about that will be crucial. There is still some dispute as to who should investigate those deaths, as I understand it. We're not absolutely certain where an investigation into, for example, a restraint-related death might be carried out, to give it the right degree of importance and independence. So there are some questions about investigating mortality under the Act, and it could hardly be more important. This ought to be the most important thing that happens in the entire NHS. These are people whose rights are removed in order, or some of them are, in order to, for their own benefit, in order to provide them with better care. That's almost a unique situation across the healthcare system. So we have to ensure that when that goes wrong and they die while being detained under state powers, that we are doing the right thing to find out why and to learn from that. So that's one thing. Alongside mortality, there is the issue of rights. I don't know whether we, at the moment, our reports over a number of years have looked at what people have said in response to questions about rights, but I don't know whether we have systematically examined how people's rights are being respected. It is a fantastic volume of inspection that we carry out under the Mental Health Act, but whether we use all the information that then becomes available to check how people's rights are respected, I'm not so certain. And we now have advocates. We ought to have Mental Health Act advocates across the system who would be a good source of information as to how local trusts perform. Thirdly, there's the issue of what the Mental Health Act achieves. Reports, because of their very nature, tend to focus on what's negative, but if the Mental Health Act isn't achieving something positive, then we probably shouldn't have one. So it's important that we set out what it achieves for the confidence of patients, for their families, and for the staff who will apply it. And then finally, there is the issue of whether there is a kind of benchmarking function that we could carry out, whether our local organisations are always keen to know how they perform in comparison to other people, you know, their neighbouring trusts, for example, and we ought to have the data on that. So we don't know whether it's good or bad when section rates go up, but we should be at least able to say whether it's happening in one trust or in several, and maybe what the reasons are.
Yes, if I can sort of relate my response also to the question or the point that Kay made about the timeline. I'm anticipating by next April we'll have done a lot of work on the fundamentals, but there's almost certainly going to be programs of work that go way beyond that, looking at the data sets that underpin the Mental Health Act and how we relate to other activities in the wider system, including around the review of deaths of people under treatment and under detention. So I'm certainly not suggesting everything will be sorted by next April, but what we will have done certainly is identify the work programs that take us beyond that to the point that you're describing, I think, Lewis.
David, I just had a question really about the Mental Capacity Act and the deprivation of liberty safeguards. My understanding is that a recent court case has extended the ambit of what had previously been understood with regard to who is subject to or is entitled to the benefit of such safeguards, and I wonder whether that has increased the potential scope of work that the Commission has to do.
I don't have an answer to that question yet, but I think, as we say in the paper, I certainly think the Care Quality Commission has to review its policy position in relation to detention and de facto detention, including places where DOLs can and are applied or might be applied. And I think we need to check that we are discharging our full responsibilities under OPCAT. We don't have the answer. I think we need to have the answer as soon as possible.
Do you have a view on that, Robert? I mean, how many more people will it catch?
Well, the case is called Cheshire West, and it's it is decided that these safeguards apply to people who have previously been regarded as voluntary residents in homes, but even if no one locks the door, if functionally they cannot move, they are being considered to be deprived of their liberty. And my anecdotal information is that the Court of Protection is currently receiving a huge number of cases in relation to this sort of activity, which previously had not been thought to be requiring such a level of scrutiny. So I don't know what the numbers are or anything like that, but there is a perception I've got in the legal world that this is causing a lot of business. So I imagine it ought to be here as well.
David, if I may. So So this was a Supreme Court judgment, which was a Cheshire West case, and we circulated to the board in the Friday briefing the fact that this judgment had been arrived at and there were some implications. And Robert's point about its extension, one of the things that we did is we issued some guidance to providers about how we would take this forward. And then as this work in the Court of Protection and in other places takes place, then we can complete the revision of our guidance. But one of our themes has been about how far the Mental Capacity Act and the Deprivation of Liberty Standards features in all of our inspections, but predominantly the hospital inspections and the social care inspections. So I think that initial rush of activity that followed the Supreme Court consideration of this, I think we've picked up, but I think your point is that there's longer term implications, and we need to make sure we've picked those up. I mean, I think Rebecca's got hold of this along with other colleagues as well. So I think we've filled the immediate, in a sense, gap that was created by the judgment, but there's more work to be done that we'll be able to do in the fullness of time.
Okay, good. Well, thanks very much for that. And Paul, while we've got you here, just give us an impression of how the mental health inspections are going.
Right, thank you. We are coming towards the end of the wave inspections. We've conducted on-site visits now to 5 plus 6, 11 mental health trusts. What I think we've demonstrated, certainly to my satisfaction, is that the general model that was developed in acute does apply in mental health. There are obviously 101 details in how we've had to adapt the model to the particular characteristics of mental health providers, particularly the very large, complex mental health services that are spread over 100 plus locations in a wide geographical area. But the model works, and certainly we're getting a very positive reception to the fundamental changes in the way the inspections are conducted, particularly the incorporation of large numbers of clinical and service management experts in the team and experts by experience. So it's been tough. I can't pretend it hasn't been, and I think that was the case for the acute wave inspections. But I think we're going to be in quite a good position come October, when we're going to be inspecting in earnest and rating proper.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Thank you all for the work that you put into it as well. That's terrific. We're going to break now for a cup of coffee. Thank you. Next paper on culture and values, Eileen. Could you press your button?
Thank you very much, David. You've got a fairly chunky and extensive paper here with you that covers a number of things. The first being the Pulse survey, which is the checkpoint we do at the mid-year to really ask staff how things are going, how they're feeling. It gives us a point of comparison at a 6-month period, and about 600 staff took part in that, so we can take some discussion around that and the generally very pleasing upward direction of travel. We can touch too on a review that has recently been undertaken by Sarah Hunter, and some of you who were here last year and predate me will remember that Sarah came in to offer the opportunity to staff to talk with us and share their views about issues particularly relating to behaviours and concerns that they saw across the organisation that were impacting negatively on them, and they felt negatively on the organisation. And we made a commitment then that Sarah would come back 1 year later to do the same, make the same offer to colleagues to come and talk to her, and that we would seek to learn from that. And then also, and most critically, so you will notice you have in front of you some lovely blue cards, and I think these were sent to you certainly over a week ago also, which set out part of our journey towards reworking the CQC values, the values that the organisation is working with currently are at least 3 years old, and obviously if we think about CQC 3 years ago and CQC now, it's an important time to think about, do the values we've inherited, most of us, reflect the sort of organisation that we are and that we will be. And so an exercise has been going on, which Jonathan Evans, who's with us today, will talk about, which has involved and engaged all of our staff in actually thinking about what are the values that best represent our CQC and one CQC. And we set those out there for you and invite you to make your contribution in terms of just highlighting the words that most resonate with the CQC that you believe that we should be. And we have made a very firm commitment to our colleagues across the organisation that the consolidation of this exercise will be made public in terms of agreement on CQC values and setting the agenda and the tone and the behaviours around them on the 1st of July, and again, Jonathan can touch on that. But I'd really like David to pass over to Tracy Dennison, our HR lead, and to Jonathan Evans, who have been leading on this work, who I know can just outline the highlights, I suspect, but then take questions, working on the assumption that everybody's had a chance to go through what I know is quite a chunky paper.
Tracy, do you want... I should have introduced you at the beginning, actually. Tracy Dennison, who is head of HR. You've been here, what, 2 months, 3 months?
4 months now.
4 months. Yeah. Right. Do you want to add to anything Eileen said, or just want to take questions?
I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah.
There's a lot of detail in the report, I know, but happy to take questions.
And Jonathan, you're happy to take
Very
questions?
happy to take questions, Chairman.
Jonathan has led the exercise on values. So, Kay.
Yes, so on the values, because obviously it is actually part of the board's role to set the values, but I totally agree it needs to be an organisational thing, and so I'm very glad that staff have been involved in discussing what their values are. There's a couple of things I'd say. One is that whatever values we choose, I would prefer ones that are, if you like, obvious to the public as well. Because like accountability, for example, it is a good value to have, but I'm not entirely sure whether the public might fully understand that. So, my preference would be to have, simple one-word things like, honesty is okay, or trust, for example. They're quite good. So it's thinking something that our staff identify with, but also the public can sort of understand. And the only other thing about it is, some of these are values and some of them aren't, and maybe I'm just a bit obsessive, but it feels odd when you've got a value and then you've got an adjective, and do you know what I mean? So I think it would be better if they were actually values as opposed to adjectives, because it just grates with me, and it may well grate with others. So.
Let's stay with the values then.
Yes, what these are words. Not values, and they're all joined together by the fact they're words, but actually it's a different sort of thing. And I think really the process that we're going through to do this, which is an internal process, is a bit worrying, because in effect it's the external relationships of these values that will matter much more than the internal.
Thanks, Paul. Any other points on the values? Or adjectives, or words? Yeah. Oh, sorry, David.
No, that's right. I think, can I just check where we are with this? It suggests that we are going to launch the values on the 1st of July in the paper. Because I would have thought, without being too critical, that we probably need about maybe 4 or 5 values rather than about 25. That cull of values probably needs a bit of discussion. It's certainly true that some of them aren't values, but I suspect it won't be all that difficult to get some of the really key elements of this into a shorter list. But if we have to do it by the 1st of July, we might need to do it now or in the next week or so.
Yeah, may I respond to the various points made? I better just describe the process, which may reassure people what they are. There is no intention to have 30 values. We're looking at somewhere between 3 and 6. The long list you have in front of you rose from a number of focus groups we held across the organisation, talking to people, listening to people, a little bit of research of other organisations, a bit of my previous experience in other organisations. From that,
we've now had a dialogue, what we call a dialogue with the organisation, where everybody has been invited to be involved and feeding in their views and their words. And I'm in the process now of writing a report for the executive team, which they will get next week, which actually highlights what are now the top 10. It's not been a vote, it's been a consultation getting in, but you know, there are 10 values that come through loud and clear. And I totally agree, they're just words. And words are always open to interpretation. The important thing is not the value word itself, but the behaviours they drive. So in the report that I'm doing, not only says that these are the top ones, but these are the behaviours. You know, if we accountable, what does that mean? How does it look? How does it feel? And we talk about, you know, the values that accountability, the behaviours accountability drives. And also, if we don't live by accountability, the things that could go wrong in the organisation. So that's all laid out in that particular piece of report. So the executive team, as a result of this consultation, will have the most popular, I guess is the best way of putting it, 10, with descriptions of, simple tagline descriptions of what the words actually mean. So they, you know, because it can open to interpretation, all words are. Simple tagline, and then underneath a series of behaviours that they would drive and things that would happen if we got it wrong. The sort of consultation, the dialogue actually closes tonight across the organisation, spending all day tomorrow finalising things, finalising the report, which will go to David and colleagues on Friday, with a view to launching it on the 1st of July.
Just on the point about being the public-facing element of that, just can I just check that, because in the end, that I agree with people who've said that's what will count in the end. Has that got to happen by the 1st of July as well? The certainty, the checking out that this is what the public want from CQC.
David and I spoke, I think earlier this week or last week, about making sure that these are words that will also resonate with the public, and that's very important indeed. But the importance of the values, and there's two things here. There's one obviously that resonates with the public, but also we want them to drive the right behaviours, the appropriate behaviours to enable this organisation, everybody in it, to relate, go in the same way and drive towards the same goals. So very conscious of the external need, but I'm very focused also on making sure that we all go in the same direction internally and can live to the same values, which I think is very important.
Jonathan, can you just remind us what the existing values are? Because these are obviously replacing the existing values.
Some of the existing values are very similar. There's integrity and accountable are both there. Pride is there, and respect is there.
Right, and what do we do at the moment? Are those publicly known? What's our? I can't remember. Do we put these on our? We don't have a strapline, do we? Where do people see those? Where do other people see those values outside the organisation?
So I think one of the issues, Camilla, is that. Notwithstanding the point that Paul's made about the public-facing stuff, but internally,
yeah, that's two separate issues here, aren't there?
Yeah, these were written and given to the organisation. There was no process by which the organisation had a sequence of debates and discussions. So the process that Jonathan has just created, which has allowed teams across the organisation to have this discussion, arrive at the view, and this list is really the product of many, many conversations that have taken place.
Sorry, that's not what I'm asking, David. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we have an internal dialogue where people feel listened to about what the values of the organisation are, and that managers can use those values to drive the right behaviours. What I am worried about, and what I think Paul is worried about, is what we do publicly with this, which seems to me to be a different thing. So my starting point is just to say, what are the existing values? Is the public aware of them, and therefore what are we saying to the public about how we change them? I'm just not clear on that part of it.
They're not used because they weren't owned by the organisation.
Okay,
the place to use is all our recruitment literature at the end of it has, and these are the values of the organisation. So they then dictate the job descriptions, which then dictate the selection criteria, which then dictate some of the conversations which have been going on.
So is there any need for us to publicly assert these values beyond the internal needs of the organisation?
My personal view is yes. because we've just had a conversation about openness and integrity and what we do when we're in a difficult position, and that for me was a demonstration. It's no surprise that integrity comes out at 70% when people have actually expressed a view about what they want it to be. Now that may or may not be the right word, and if you do the word association on this, integrity and openness, are they the same, are they different? So there's some sequencing to do, but I think it is important that the words we use have both an internal and an external meaning.
Absolutely. I mean, the old ones were imposed and they weren't owned. So it's really good that the organisation has been involved in those. So, it's, and I don't know that we need to sort of be very public about them because they drive our internal, the way we do things. But I think they do need to be understandable to the public. That was
I agree with that. I wasn't sure how far we're sort of proactively pushing this stuff out, because I think that's where I would get a bit nervous.
Yeah.
So I just don't know what your plan is,
Part of the internal-external issue, it seems to me, is this, that these words could be, as words, describing internal behaviour, that is, how staff, boards and so on treat each other, or how the organisation treats the public. Both are important, and the same values, I would have thought, need to get across those borders. But whatever we put out, either to staff, ourselves, or the public, it seems to me, needs to communicate the fact that this is a behaviour, a value that we endorse in our work with the public and our work with each other. And I don't know how you do that with a list of words without putting something around it.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Paul?
Thank you, Chairman. I suppose I looked at these and thought about other instances where I've seen values in organisations I've been associated with, and my feeling was that these are interesting words. Some of them are very fluffy. They're all quite nice words, and there's not much which is very challenging, apart from challenge in there. And I wondered whether that was right for an organisation that is looking to be investigative and to actually hold people to account, and to do you think, is there something more hard-edged values potentially around scepticism or something like that? I hate to sort of be negative, but these are all very positive values. How do we drive the right sort of behaviours in our people out of this? How do we make sure the public feels and our paymasters feel that we are delivering the results behind it as well? So in another organisation we have values which include results-driven, includes team, working as one team, includes customer orientation or customer-centric behaviours, those sorts of things which are, I appreciate they're more businessy oriented, but they have a little bit more around performance, about doing stuff, about getting it right, which goes a little bit beyond here. And I would say that I don't think you need to necessarily stay with the one-word bit for a value. I think it may be better to drift a bit from pure values into something which gets you to what you really want the organisation to be doing. And I think taking what the organisation has come up with and then translating it a bit and showing the link between it, and that might be the way to get something which is you're able to use for the organisation as a whole. I don't think you can have internal values and external which aren't expressed externally. I think you actually have to express them externally. I think they should be out there right up front about the way you do business. That's what values should be driving, and otherwise they're not really worth much.
Anna, and then we'll come to you, Jonathan.
Sorry, so want to agree with a great deal of what's been said, and I suppose at the risk of adding to the list, I agree with Paul. There's something kind of missing here about being decisive and firm, and the other things that regulators actually have to be. So, but that's not the primary point. The primary point for me is just to focus on the point that Kay started with, which is the role of the board. So I understand the role of the board in relation to the values, not to create them, but to own them, and having owned them, to hold the organisation accountable for delivering on them in all of its internal and its external relationships. Camilla's right. There's a kind of question about how much we actually communicate the values as a matter of and how meaningful they are to the general public. But there's a really important question about us holding the organisation to account for living those and in all of their interactions with the public. And I don't feel these are anywhere near ready, and I would feel very uncomfortable agreeing to something being published as the values we want to adopt on the 1st of July without the board having had the opportunity to know that they have some resonance with the public, and that's not just our own assessment, but something a bit more than that, I think, and that they are things which we feel we can hold the organisation to account for. So I'm afraid I want to say there's some more process that has to go around this, and I think ultimately before anything is published, it needs to come back to the board for us to sign off on them as a tool that we can use for a very important governance function.
I'm afraid when I joined the organisation, I wasn't necessarily aware of what the previous values were. And so on about day 2, when I had to get up and describe the new hospital inspection programme, I invented some for the time being, which weren't necessarily values, but it's what I personally wanted the inspection programme to be, which happened to be that it should be robust, it should be fair, it should be transparent, and when possible, it should be helpful, recognising that not all individual providers are going to find every judgment we make to their liking. But it's interesting, I've used that in public quite a lot and never had any comeback saying that it's not in the right area. I'm not saying it couldn't be improved.
One point. We don't want to get into adding lots of values to the list, I'm sure, but there's one sort of overriding value, which is that we're which on the board we should be more conscious of than anybody else, which is that we are here to act in the public interest. Although you could interpret some of these values in that way, that surely is the most overriding, or do I mean fundamental, that is the value that drives everything else. And isn't that the one that we need to get out more than any other to the public? Well, that we're acting in the public interest, so that we're acting on behalf of the public. So accountability is one word, but it's accountability to the public, that we're acting on behalf of the public, which drives all of the work. And getting that statement out at a time when people are worried about professional collusion and those sort of things is perhaps the most important part of it.
Jonathan, I don't think we can just debate words like this. We've got to see the behaviours behind the words, and I think the board does need to have a say on that, actually. I think you'll go to your executive team next week, and you'll debate this further, and you'll come up with the behaviours that lie behind the words. But my feeling is that it needs to come back to the board before we can go snap on them. Unless you feel that that's not possible now for some reason.
Well, anything's possible. So, in a sense, if that's the board's wish, then that's what we'll do. And I will respect that judgment. So there's a challenge about how externally facing it is. It's a good one. I don't know how we'd do that. There's a challenge, we've been through a pretty exhaustive exercise over the past 3 months, so this isn't something that's not touched the sides. If we're trying to create ownership, I'm absolutely with it about we can finesse the words and whether the words are right, and there's some really good challenges. But if I am with Anna, I absolutely understand this point, that it is the role of the board to actually set the values of the organisation and hold it to account. I thought we'd been trying to do that by sending these out over the time, and whether it all needs to be done in a meeting or not is one of the kind of key issues. But with the very best grace, David, if the board isn't happy with it, then they won't go, and we'll have a different conversation with all the managers on the 1st of July. The issue is we've got 400 managers coming on the 1st of July to have a conversation about values. Now, you could say I've got this wrong, in which case I take full responsibility. So we'll have a different kind of conversation with them. So we'll actually tweak that, and then it can come back. You must be satisfied as a board that these values represent what you want to hold me and the executive team to account for, and that these are going to be embedded in the organisation, and we must be satisfied that they actually speak internally and externally. So it's not what we were planning, but if that's a view of the board, then that's what we'll do. And as I say, we'll do that with good grace.
I think every time the executive team have come up with a proposal, we've discussed it here, and actually normally as a result of that discussion, it has got better.
No, you've added value.
I mean, I don't mean that sounds. I didn't mean it to come out quite like that. But I think it's improved. I mean, something that was already outstanding has just come a little bit more out. And I think
going towards the perfect.
Yeah. And I think it will be better to come back here. And I think you should narrow these down and develop them. Take into account it must be public-facing as well as internal. It needs a harder edge. Those kinds of comments.
It's a good challenge. David, you're absolutely right. Everything that we've brought here, as you've added value to, and I don't think we should actually draw a different line around this one. The plan was on a different trajectory, but if the plan needs to be revised, the plan needs to be revised, and that's what we'll do. So I don't think we should turn this into a big issue. We just need to rethink what we do on the...
Well, I think the board is saying this is an important issue. This is an important thing, and we need to have another discussion about it.
And I wouldn't want to lose the rest of the organisation's views either. And I think that's really important in this. It isn't just... I mean, obviously we set the values, but there has been a whole process and things have come out of it. And I think that does need to be very influential to whatever the final sort of final values are.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll bring that back to the next meeting, because I think we need to maximise the momentum that we've got. So let's take the report, let's go to the conference, and then let's bring it back. I think it's the 18th of July is our next meeting, so we'll bring it. 30. Okay, well, we'll bring it back to that meeting.
Okay. Thank you. Jonathan, thanks very much. Sorry to put a temporary spoke in the progress, but... Tracy, did you have any other issues on HR you wanted to highlight?
Not unless anybody's got any comments on the remainder of the report in respect to the survey results and the Sarah Hunter work.
Okay, Jennifer.
Thanks so much for the survey, which looks very useful. Just two things. One is the slide which shows that the level of people who would like to improve certain areas, and there's one area which is sort of outstanding, which is the fact about effective systems and processes to enable my work. So it wasn't so much workload, it was more effective systems. So that's one point. And then the second issue that jumped out to me was the slightly lower results across the board in a number of questions from the National Consumer Service Centre. And I wondered what was happening there and whether you could say more.
Well, I'll take the issues of systems and processes, and I'm sure that Tracy can follow up with the NCSC some further commentary. But on systems and processes, we're fully aware that our systems and processes are not in good order, not wholly in good order, actually, Jennifer. They have been designed to do other things, and we've changed most of what we do. So the systems and processes need to follow the redesign of inspection methodologies, and that involves a lot of unpicking, a lot of rethinking. We also are very conscious we need to make investments actually in our infrastructure, particularly our IT infrastructure, and that is happening. One of the really encouraging things that I was talking about and with yesterday was actually some fundamental redesign of our IT systems, and the redesign is being taken from the perspective of somebody who is not office-based. And that's actually a very important perspective to take as we move to an organisation which will be close to 2/3 of people who are working office independent. So we need them when they are mobile and at home to be able to work effectively and productively, and our systems to date have not supported that. So we're making a great investment in actually unpicking. We've so far found 300 inhibitors to efficient and productive work, and we are unpicking those and rebuilding from the basis of the perspective of the person who has to do the work. That's just one example, but we have many where actually the internal wiring needs to be completely unpicked and put together in some instances to make it more efficient, make people feel that they are supported in doing their work. and to allow us to be productive, because at the end of the day, that is fundamentally what we need to do, and what most of, all of our colleagues want to do, is to be able to do their jobs and do them productively and do them well. And we are, it's not going to be an instant fix, is what I would say, is because it's a very big undertaking.
Messaging is being clearly communicated to staff, because I think that could help with morale, couldn't it? That actually this is a journey, and although one of our values at the moment is effectiveness, actually we're not there yet, and this is going to take X number of months.
We take every route that we can think of to communicate the fact that we recognise that things aren't good, and that B, we are putting in place what I call fixes and patches to get us through, but that also that we're doing a much bigger whole system rethink of how we work, where we work, and the tools that we make available to people to do that, and trying to get that message out. And it's a hard message when people are working incredibly hard and getting frustrated with some of the systems and processes. To be able to say, actually, the fixes only get you so far, the rethink is going to take, in some cases, the lead time will be 12 to 18 months and beyond. And that's a hard message. But the journey has begun to get this right, and we will continue to message hard on it. At the NCSC, well, I'll pass over to Tracy in terms of things that we are doing. I think one of the things that I would preface this commentary by is by saying the NCSC, for those colleagues who don't know what it does, it's a 350-seat contact centre principally, that does an awful lot of our front-facing customer work. In terms of those that come to us for concerns, complaints, safeguarding issues. It does a lot of document management, it does a lot of business support into the organisation, supports on an inspection planning. So it is a very busy area of activity for CQC. And we recruit in Newcastle an incredibly talented workforce into that area. And one of the benefits for the organisation of that, so I think it's important to give some context, has been that very talented workforce often migrates into the other parts of CQC. We scoop the talent out and we'll bring new talent in. So it's a very ambitious, very dynamic area, and actually unlike many contact centre environments that you will find because of the way that CQC is set up and the location in Newcastle. So we're very lucky to have it in many respects, and it is an absolutely core fundamental plank of the work that CQC does. Notwithstanding all of that, we have some very stubborn issues within NCSC, some of which Jonathan and Tracy will talk about, are not unusual in a contact centre environment, and it's not to excuse them, but which we are working very hard to identify root cause, and then to work through how we can actually make the changes which are very visible, and I think that's quite important in that environment, visible and visibly understood, that we are taking these concerns seriously. So I'll pass over to Tracy, who can just talk about some of the particulars there.
Thank you. And just on the issue around systems and process before we move on, I think one of the important things about that is, people's reality is what matters. So I think when people are answering the questions in the survey, and we're going to be doing the next survey in July, and if you couldn't get on the system the day before to upload something, that's the thing that sets your view about how you answer. So, I think some of these things people reflect on a lot more, but I think the reality of people's working experiences is all important, I think, around that issue, and that's the feedback we're getting about that question. So there is a lot of plans in place, but I think that will still be. That will still be a difficult area until people's reality changes. I think in respect to the NCSC, people have probably visited the NCSC. It's a very different working environment to the rest of the organisation. It's not gone through the type of change that the rest of the organisation, but it's heard about it. And I think that's part of what's been going on for them, is that they've seen the organisation changing and shifting, and and the messages about, well, what does this mean? How is this going to impact on us? And it is impacting on them greatly. Some of the concerns, the NCSC, I think, also talking to managers, it's grown in such a short period of time from nothing to this, big operation. And I think some of the ways of working, staff are very engaged in that. It's a call centre, but actually, incredibly engaged group of staff who care passionately about what they do and therefore engage about the way in which they're managed. So some of the issues that staff have raised, we are addressing. So one of the big concerns is that there is a great turnover of staff, both coming into the NCSC and moving out into the rest of the organisation because they're a considerable talent pool, as Eileen says. We're moving, or the NCSC management are moving from having a lot of temps to making a lot of those permanent and changing the models. They're having a much more an 80% permanent workforce and a 20% temps. So the opportunity to do that, which will be happening in the next few weeks, is a big opportunity for us to say, OK, we're going to do this in a different way, a way that reflects some of the values issues that we've discussed, much more transparent, because there are concerns that there's a lot of favouritism, that there's nepotism, that people are picked for projects, and those projects then lead to better jobs. Now, in order to demonstrate that isn't the case, because we don't believe it is, but we are going to work on how we do the recruitment and selecting people for opportunities in a very different and transparent way. In order to, as I say, to be able to demonstrate to staff and challenge some of the assumptions, even if we don't agree with them, if those are the beliefs that people have, we need to work with them. So those are some of the things that we're going to be doing, and lots of work around communication and engagement of individuals and groups within there. Another area that's caused concern there is around how performance is managed, and people being concerned about appraisal and performance review. So again, one of the conversations we're having is, because it is a large group of staff with a lot of team leaders and line managers, is actually looking to have fewer performance managers, but having those being much more skilled at actually having those performance conversations. So having lots of people who manage the work as a team leader, but actually making performance something which is done really, really well by investing in fewer people having those performance review conversations. And those are all things that we think will relate and respond directly to the concerns that staff have expressed, to share and also demonstrate that we are listening and doing things differently as a result.
Let's just say that's good to hear. I mean, it's been quite a jewel, this centre, hasn't it? The morale, the energy level, and so on. And just to see those figures, just to keep it top of our mind, I guess, is with our.
Thanks, Jennifer. Were there any other questions for? Okay,
it's about the culture and the workload, and we know that staff are working extremely hard, and in fact, I think that they're actually being hugely heroic. Actually, and we shouldn't sort of underestimate that. They're doing they're really dedicated and working really hard. So I guess in terms of the culture, I think we need to be careful that doesn't become the norm. We want people to work hard and be dedicated, but some of the hours that people are working are really quite long. So I would hope, as we recruit and change, that actually I'd expect that would change, because I don't think it's sustainable, and I'd be really looking quite hard to see that is being addressed. And alongside that, I'd be particularly interested in, what we do around staff well-being. I know things are happening, but I think we need to, as well as sort of support and listen to our staff, that maybe to sort of look after them as well a bit. So in time, I'd be quite interested to know a bit more about, what we could do around that. And finally, there's the last issue, which it is an operational issue, but I will raise it anyway, is that I'm being told that staff are doing lots of overtime, but they don't know if they're going to be paid for their overtime. And they're saying, well, we can't take time in lieu because, there's too much to do. So I'd just like to sort of understand, because I think it is a morale. We've got people working really hard and are being heroic, and then to be told that they might not get overtime pay. And I just would like to sort of understand that a bit and to see, will it be resolved? Because I think it is impacting on people.
I'm sure that Tracy and indeed David might have some views on this, but first of all, to go to our duty of care and the well-being of staff. It's very, very important to us, and we do know that we're asking a lot of them, Kay. A lot is being asked of everybody across the organisation. So we do all the usual things that you would expect a good employer to do, and we do encourage people to make us aware when they feel that things are becoming too much. We are, as David said in his opening statement, to go to workload and how we're dealing with it. We know that in some areas of the organisation, and it is not universal that it is across all areas, but we do have teams which are understaffed, and we do now have a pipeline of new colleagues joining us. So over the next few months, that we hope will tail off. It won't tail off completely, and as we go into 2015-16, we will still be recruiting staff to get us to 100% of the inspection commitment that we have made. So again, as I was talking about systems and processes, this issue of work and momentum is going to be with us for some while before we get to what you might call steady state. Now, we have said to staff very clearly a few things. First of all, we have a bank of staff colleagues who've been with us for some while, and we have asked them if they can actually do more work for us. So we have invited them to tell us whether they will work out of traditional geographies that they've been in and are willing to do more hours than they might usually do. We've also said very clearly to colleagues in most areas that toil is still possible to have, and that actually we're telling managers to make that clear, that there is no, there are only one or two areas in the organisation where it should be impossible currently for toil to be executed, and we have told managers that that's the case and are encouraging staff to take it. Overtime in principle is not a good thing from a duty of care perspective to an employee, and that is our fundamental concern at the moment. So I marry that with the other concern, which I know that boringly, and colleagues are very bored with me on this subject, we also have to be very sure that we can afford it. So we're not seeking to exploit people, we need to look after them, and we need to make sure that we are exercising prudence in all of our resources before we make decisions around overtime. Now, in one or two areas, we are looking actively to see whether it's possible, but actually it is not a good thing to do. So we're trying all other routes and remedies before we get there, Kay. And I think I hope you'd agree with me that that is the right thing to do.
Any other questions for Eileen, Tracy, or Jonathan? Good. Thank you very much. Thanks, Eileen. Thanks, Tracy.
So this is an update to how we're considering reviews, what we've previously discussed as appeals against ratings. It follows the March public board paper and discussion that we had. If I sort of pick out the highlights from the paper, to say that we haven't had a formal approach for a review, we think that's in large part down to the fact that we are being as open as possible and engaging in as good a dialogue as possible with providers as we go through the process. There are a number of stages before we would get to any sort of formal review. As we've set out previously and in this paper, we think a review should only take place at the point at which the inspection report is published. That gives plenty of opportunity through factual accuracy, for example, but also through the ongoing dialogue as we confirm the ratings for providers to raise concerns with us, and of course we're open and we talk to them about that. And Mike can give a sort of view, perhaps particularly on how that's going on in the acute sector. Also committed to doing this sort of transparently through the board meetings and making sure the public are aware of the way we're considering this. What the paper is seeking to do is provide an update on the thinking. It's very much we're seeing this as a process of thinking as we move towards October and the regulations under the Care Act and the Care Act itself being something we can fully go for, including new rules and regulations around ratings themselves. But one of the things that we've developed or thought through has been what do we actually mean by review? and we think it should be much more a process than a specific event of a formalised hearing. So one of the previous conversations we've had is would the person requesting the review or body then attend a hearing? Well, I think the point from our perspective is not the hearing isn't the thing. The thing is the process of reviewing the documentation, given that the review itself would largely be on whether the process of getting to ratings and aggregating them was the right one, rather than elements of factual accuracy or disagreements with our methodology, which are kind of covered through other processes. One of the other things that the paper is trying to highlight is that we think it's important that there's consistency in the approach to reviews across all the different sectors that we regulate. As in a number of things, the acute sector is one where we've started a little bit earlier. So two consequences. One is that as we roll out across all sectors, we need to make sure that anything we're doing in the acute sector is not sort of going to disadvantage or be difficult for another sector. And going backwards, we then might need to sort of change the approach that we take in the acute sector as we learn about how these things in the other sectors. So it's just a sense of the realities of driving a sort of consistency agenda. So I think the board's being asked to do two things, really. One is, if you turn to page 6 of the paper, there's a series of proposals, some of which I would say are quite operational, but we wanted to just sort of give you the full detail of what we're planning on doing. I would say that the one perhaps to sort of look at most carefully is their bullet point 3, just where we make that point about it not being inevitable that reviews would have a formal hearing, seeing them more as a process rather than an event. Possibly to reflect on this point about consistency, and also in Appendix 1, just to look at the job description that we are suggesting for the independent reviewer. We're suggesting 2 independent reviewers in the first instance. And for those from the previous discussion who did want to see the organisation's current or previous values, I think they're expressed as the competencies on the last page or 2.
Just a quick question. Last time we discussed this, you quoted a salary range for the independent reviewers that I thought was too high.
Yes.
Because I didn't think we needed QCs necessarily to be doing this job. So can you just update us on what you're going to be... are you going to be telling the headhunters something slightly lower, or where are you on that?
Significantly lower, I think. I think we always want to put that in just as the absolute top of ever, considerations. We weren't in a situation where we were going back to the board and saying, well, actually thought it was a bit higher. In practice, I think the number was 1,000 to 2,000 a day. I don't think.
But whatever it was.
Yeah, it was that. So I don't think we need to be going that high. Full stop.
So you can assure us that we will not be paying that top level.
Can I say, let us go through the headhunter process, see if we can get the right people at significantly below that level. If we find that we can't get people of the calibre we want, then I guess we'd have to come back. But our intention is not to have to pay those rates.
Looked at it recently, but the transparency with which we compile a rating, is that granular enough at the moment in order to be able to, I guess, head off or reduce the number of challenges?
So it's set out in the provider handbooks for consultation. The consultation closed just over a week ago, I think, from memory. So we're just collecting the responses on that, but it was set out in quite some detail then following the board discussions. Those are all those aggregation principles. So we'll see what people said as to whether they feel it was clear enough, but it's all those points about 2 requires improvements, equaling an overall requires improvement.
Paul mentioned I could say something about what's actually happening in practice on this. I mean, board members will remember that in Wave 1 we shadow rated 3 of the 18 trusts and then published those together with the Wave 1 report. And for each of those shadow trusts, we offered them a conversation, mainly by phone, about the ratings, and I think they found that helpful. And largely, this is talking them through why we have come to a decision that something either requires improvement or is inadequate. Surprisingly, they're not worried when it's good or outstanding, and in Wave 2, we have continued that where necessary, and so a number of chief executives have asked about particular ratings. I have offered them a phone call, and so far that has always resolved the issues.
And sorry, just to say, I think that that's brilliant. But with 25,000 locations for adult social care, I mean, I think the point that Paul has made around trying to ensure some consistency across the piece, we do have to be careful about the expectations that, as much as I would love to have a conversation with everybody about each one of their, I'm physically not going to be able to do that. So we're going to have to think about how we do handle this in an appropriate and proportionate way for the different sizes of our sectors that we're regulating.
I'm not even saying it should necessarily always be me within the Hospitals Directorate. I would hope that my DCIs and others will have those conversations too. Up till now, it happens to have been me.
Jennifer, just one more.
Just the processes by which we check consistency of our judgments against agreed facts. So where the facts aren't in dispute, but there may be consistency issues in the judgment of those facts, despite the granularity of the handbook. Do we have an ongoing process of assessing that?
Shall I start with that, Mike, and do you want to? So I think there's three, at least sort of three prongs to it. So there's the work that Mike does and spends a great deal of time with DCIs and others on the quality assurance groups. So to make absolutely sure as we go through what the inspectors think the answer should be, rating by rating, that's consistent as people who see multiple different providers. There's secondly the route that we're developing on the wider assurance of that process, which goes through to the Regulatory Governance and Values Committee that Michael chairs, with work led by Louise Dyneley and others. And the third piece is the evaluation work that Kieran Walsh has been doing to sort of inform us on the area, as much as I think it's the risks to the process, to make sure that we've got them covered. And I think there's a report coming back next month to the board on his final report. Yes, it is, yes.
Can I just, because I think it is really interesting to see how we apply this across into the broader areas, and I think it does start with us being much clearer than we have been around the characteristics of what a good and outstanding service is and what an inadequate or a requires improvement service is, so that actually Paul's absolutely right, the kind of assurance that we need to have, but we need to be starting it right from the beginning in terms of how we're equipping our inspectors to know what good looks like, to be able to collect the evidence through the intelligent monitoring and through the inspection teamwork to get to the rating, so that there is transparency in terms of the information that goes into the report, which can then link across to those characteristics, so that people can see that right at the outset. The sort of approach around reviewing that, ensuring that there's an assurance around that, will happen in each of the directorates, although obviously in slightly different ways given the volumes and the three directorates that we've got.
I think this is probably, as we've said before, the biggest challenge is consistency. The way we are approaching it absolutely is to try and define what good looks like and be as clear as possible about that. And I think we've made major steps forward. Our second step is then in training our inspection team, so that they really know that and they understand that. And we're going to have a big sort of blitz on that over the summer, particularly related to our 8 core services in the acute hospitals, making sure that people do know what we're looking for and know how we are rating them. But part of this is that it's now that we've done around 50 National Quality Assurance Group meetings for different trusts, we've actually seen where the problems may lie and the things that we need to be consistent about. There are things that frankly I hadn't thought about at the outset, but which are clearly important that we should be consistent about. To give just one example, in outpatient clinics, it sometimes happens that notes are not available. That can both impact on patient safety. If you don't know what's been going on in the past, it can impact on patients being delayed while information is found about them from other sources, so it can be affect responsiveness as well. But we didn't know where the bars were in the NHS, and we are now getting to the point where we've seen enough information coming through that we can say this is where we would put inadequate for that particular rating. But that's something which we hadn't thought of at the outset, and there are multiple examples like that.
I mean, it's obvious, the obvious point that time and experience is going to increase consistency of judgment. So there's a real issue of keeping obviously a gimlet eye on the churn through our inspection teams and to try to come to agreement about what is an appropriate proportion of people that we're really aiming for that's consistent each time in each team.
And just in response to that, by now having the DCIs taking on the chairing role quite frequently in our inspections, not exclusively, we still have a lot of very able outsiders doing that, having almost all of our inspections now being led by a head of hospital inspection, and they've all done, I think, 6, 8 or 10 between them each. So we're really getting to a point where we are getting more of that consistency, and now it's down at the inspector level that we need it as well.
Paul, is that okay? Agreed? Happy with that? Yeah.
If people are content with the bullets and so forth.
Yeah, thank you. Michael Meyer would have presented the next item, but he's not here today, so Eileen, you're going to do that instead, I think.
I'll try to do a good impression of Michael for you, but I'm sure I'm going to fail, sadly.
There'll be a long pause.
As I said, I'm sure I'm going to fail, David. I mean, I spoke to Michael about the report, and he is content that it's accurate, it stands, it highlights areas where we know we need to improve, areas where the Audit and Corporate Governance Committee has picked up the mantle, picked up the bit, and where we look forward to Paul actually helping us to drive much greater improvement in the coming year. And I think it does also highlight where the CQC is taking these issues around risk, in issues around process and assurance of what we're doing very seriously, and investing significant amounts of management time and effort in trying to, we're not quite at the point of embedding because we are still building what good processes look like, and then there's a process of education. Then we'll move towards embedding. So a little like the answer I gave to Jennifer about how quick is the fix. I don't think it's instant, but I think the awareness of the importance of what's being noted here has grown very significantly in the last year. The activity around it has certainly built, and the capability. And in the next year, I would hope that when Paul will present this report next year, that we'll be in a different place. But I will try to take questions. I won't answer them with anything like the clinical precision that Michael does, but I'll do my very best.
Camilla?
Thanks, Eileen. Given the very serious issues that this report raises, should we not have a report to the next board meeting rather than waiting till next year?
I suppose where I am on this, I was waiting for Paul Roux, who's the new chairman of the Audit Committee, to spend a month or two maybe to review where we are and ask him to provide us a report probably in September.
Okay.
Do you feel that's okay?
Yeah, I think it's a very good report. I think it doesn't pull its punches. It's very clear that it can't give us the assurance we should expect. And we kind of all knew that, but when you see it written down on a piece of paper, it's slightly alarming.
Yeah. I have felt for a long time that the Audit Committee was not up to scratch. It's putting it kindly. And Paul, I think I made that clear to you when you were applying for this job, that you weren't taking over a well-oiled machine. So I'm really hoping that Paul will really look at this in great detail over the next couple of months. Have you any sort of early reflections?
I'm puzzled, I think is probably where I put it. I don't take quite the same degree of panic about it, if you like, or as could be read into it. We regret that we are unable to give the board the level of assurance which we would like, which we believe the board should be able to expect. And then across the audit programme, internal audit was not able to offer full assurance in any of the areas reviewed. Substantial assurance was offered in 4 areas, partial assurance in 10 and limited in 1. I'm not quite sure what those ratings mean in this context. And I think this afternoon we've got the governance report, which we're looking at as well, the draft of that. I wasn't entirely sure what it meant.
Right, yeah.
I have seen other places where you certainly don't get full assurance on everything by any means.
No, I mean, I think we're an
organisation
organisation in transition, and we know that creates a lot of risks. So I agree. You know,
and it's a question of how current these audits were, because if they were done early in the year, then maybe things have moved on since then as well. But so I'm puzzled at the moment. I'm puzzled. I'm certainly not going to take away from what Michael said here, that that you'd obviously like to see better report, and that surely has to be where we're going over the next year or so in terms of getting better assurance around things. But I don't quite know how difficult it is.
Could I ask
I
one
wonder,
question?
Camilla, whether we ought to have this discussion when Michael Meyer is here as well.
Yeah, I'm sure we should.
Perhaps why don't we? Can we park this for a month?
Yeah. Could I ask one question? And I know I'm sorry I've asked this before, and I still feel puzzled. To use your phrase, can I just understand to what extent the Audit Committee is responsible for assuring the board of the financial management of the organisation? I still am not clear on that.
It's certainly one of the areas that the Audit Committee should be looking at in terms of the adequacy of the processes and the systems of the management of the finances of the organisation, yes.
Good, okay, well that's the first time I felt we've had, okay, good.
I don't like seeing a paragraph saying that we're able to give the board assurance and stuff. I mean, it's sort of, you think, well, if you can't give us that assurance, then that is a serious issue. I mean, that's how I think a layman reading this would read it. I
think it also depends on what the areas that we can't give assurance are, because if it was that they couldn't give assurance over the finances in the sense of the accounts, then we'd be in trouble. But then if the accounts are getting audited and there's a clear opinion on that, then that would not one should say, well, okay, it's not that particular area which is a concern. It may be around all sorts of other areas of assurance about management processes and so on internally, which is an important area, but a different one.
So what I think it's useful to say is that the basis upon which Michael appropriately made his statement was on the basis of an internal audit plan, which was legacy and historic, and didn't actually and doesn't reflect quite a lot of what has gone on since. It does not mean that we would have substantial assurance across everything that we do in the organisation at the moment, because that's not true. But if we look at the 2-year forward look around what we are going to have internal audit look at, it is a very proactive, very well managed, very well structured set of activities. So I think when Michael and I discussed this, he was quite keen that we were reminding ourselves that we were using the lens of legacy, and it wasn't fully reflected of where we are, albeit we know that we've probably gained new risks as others have diminished. The financial side of life is that the Audit Committee properly will make sure that the systems and processes are in place. You will look to ET and the senior colleagues to make sure that actually the spending is appropriate, and that's what we would report here to the board. The Audit Committee will, in summation at the end of the year, ensure that actually the annual report and the accounts are appropriate, and that the auditing and assurance processes around those have been completed, and that is the function of audit. So I don't want to go on, but I think Michael was quite keen when I spoke to him to remind me when I was saying, oh dear, this doesn't read very well, does it? To absolutely remind me that actually quite a lot of this is the lens of the past, and what we need to be very careful and mindful of is that the lens of the present and the future are probably as important now.
I think you very helpfully put your finger on something there, which is what I think bothers me. I have always expected that the Audit Committee of this board should look at spending as well, not just sign off on year to date, have we spent the money that we've got in the budget, but also how wisely have we spent that money. We just need some kind of independent view of that, don't we?
It would be unusual for an audit committee to do that, Camilla.
Well, not on other organisations that I've sat on. It's not.
Well, we're doing a lot of work. We are going to be a lot of work on whether or not we're getting value for what we spend, sort of value-added work. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, value for money, I suppose.
Yeah, value for money. Well, that is absolutely something I've talked to Paul Roux about a lot.
And,
that is a very important part. Yeah.
And indeed, our auditors and our NAO colleagues, one of the challenges that they bring is about value for money and the processes around which we buy things. That's not a monthly run rate analysis of spending, but it is about processes, value for money. Are you using all best avenues to operate commercially, I suppose, to use it? So that's a challenge that they bring, and which increasingly internally we're deploying also, Camilla. So I hope that's helpful.
I'm so sorry to prolong this. So how does that connect in? So you're getting advice from those people. How does that connect into to the board?
So the way it connects in via the audit committee is that they will give opinions on activities that we undertake. That connects into the reporting that that committee makes to here, which is the governance line that we have.
Okay, so the next time we are asked to sign off a large amount of money for something, I mean, this is where it comes home to the board, because in the past we haven't had an ideal process for this. We will have, obviously, your advice, hopefully, and we will have the audit committee, Paul will also have some sort of detailed view of whether we should spend the money. But I mean, that's really what I'm talking about.
I think I see where you're going now. I guess what you would normally expect to see is that there is, first of all, there's a process for making sure that when you buy something, you commit to buying something, that's done appropriately and the right assessment is done of what you expect to get out of it, and that you're paying the right amount for that. What would then happen is that there'd be, once it's been spent and done, if you like, that there would be some sort of review of the post-spend, post-implementation review of, did we get what we expected? Did we get the value out of it that we want to do? And that would be something that would normally be done by management. So if you have a particular project, a post-project review is a normal piece of work, and that would be something that would be done by management. And the reports on that, I think, probably should come through both Audit Committee and the Board, actually, not just through the Audit Committee in that respect. So where there are specific bits of a bit unusual expenditure in particular, I think that would be an appropriate route to take.
Just remind me of the limits that need to come to the Board for spend. Is it
£1 million and above need to come to the Board.
Can we come back to this? Because... No, I think you're expressing a nervousness that we all have, I think, in this area. Can we come back for a more structured discussion about this in September, when Michael Meyer is here as well, but when, Paul, you've had a chance to sort of see what the Audit Committee has been up to? Can we park it till September, Camilla?
I say, it's not that I don't have faith in Eileen to make all these decisions. I mean, you're absolutely on this value for money thing, and I know you are. It's not that I'm not saying anything about the organisation in that respect. I just think that we are accountable to taxpayers, and I think we just need to be a little bit clearer about the way we do that.
Could I just say though, David, it isn't just Eileen. It's all of us who have operational responsibility and budget accountability for the way that we spend money. I've got a budget of many millions and 800 staff and all of the rest of it. And actually, through the board performance reports and the finance management reports, that is the other mechanism by which the board holds those of us with operational responsibility to deliver on this accountable for what we do. And so I think it's kind of part and parcel of the same thing. So it's not to kind of undermine what you're saying, Camilla, but I think that it's not just a responsibility of the person who's got finance in their title. It's actually the responsibility of all of us who are strategic and operational managers within the organisation.
Part of the nervousness is we have not had good management accounts either. We haven't had either, actually, and that's been the problem. We haven't had good management accounts for the board either, and what we will do from next month.
Yeah.
So that's So
what
hopefully when we have the combination of good management accounts and we have an audit committee in which we have trust, I think a lot of our nervousness will go away.
And if I may... And if I may, what would therefore be helpful when we come back to this in September is actually to see how those two things interact with each other, rather than just kind of what the audit committee does, but actually how we transparently and effectively manage our resources through the management line as well as through the audit and assurance line.
Well, we will see the new management accounts at the next meeting, so that's the first part of the jigsaw. Right, thank you for that. Any other business from the board? Bren, you've sat through very patiently the last few hours, having got on your bus at 4:20 this morning. Is there anything you'd like to ask us?
That wasn't a luxury, that one, really, but that was a word of commitment, and you must stand by that, David, as we said, really. When you say, you know, I can't make that board meeting, I'll try and make next one, really. You know, we stand by our word, really. Yeah, I wrote down a couple of things, really, as the board conversations took place, really. And if I may, I'll go there very briefly, really. I mean, Camilla's point about the conversation around safety and complaints. And when I took the booklets from your rack outside, the other aspect, and it's right behind you, really, is the quality aspect as well, really. Is again, making sure that the quality aspect of that runs right through it as well, in terms of the safety as well as the complaints. So just jot that one down. Mike's comment around consistency came up. And to be honest, if we're looking at high support and high challenge, I think that might come up at board meetings again and whatever, really, because I think it's so crucial, that aspect of consistency all the way through. David, you mentioned about the bit about the layperson and that, really, in terms of looking at that assurance and whatever, really. And I think it's about really understanding that, really. What does that actually mean? You know, on a day-to-day basis, a lady called Jan in Kingfisher, locally for me, always reminds me very, very clearly, what does that actually mean? What does that really mean? What do those words really mean at a grassroots level with people and the most vulnerable people we're serving, really? And in terms of the assurance, really, the bit about that was we talked a lot about process, and that's really important. But I just wrote the word outcome down there as well, really. What's the real meaning of the outcome for that? I think Kay's point, really, which she used, or word that she used in terms of discussion on behaviour around choose. And I look at Public Health England's website and see what Duncan Selby's put up there and what he puts out in his Friday messages, really. And that's something about how people and organisations choose to behave, not how they behave, how those individuals choose to behave on a day-to-day, minute-by-minute basis, both internally with one another and externally as well, really. And I think he's put some really good stuff on his Public Health England website around behaviours and what the behaviours actually really mean as well, and some of the detail behind them. I think Camilla's point, right, sorry to come back, Camilla, again, really, but that bit about, well, great, but the outward-facing aspect of it, what does that really mean for people? So I've had the high-level discussions around the board today, but actually, what does that then really mean when it filters down? I just want to, if I may, just offer an example of why you've got some very tremendous staff who I've heard are working, you know, pretty much flat out. And I just want to pay credit to Sue McMillan, really, who works in Steve's directorate. And I want to just highlight why that is. Two reasons, really, is because what we're going to hopefully support locally is how we look at those wraparound services and the life course model being led at a community level, really. And we're going to look at how what that really means for big national organisations, really. And I dropped Sue an email, really, to say, look, you know, that's the approach to it, really. And suddenly came back to say, well, actually, would you like to come and sit on the advisory group for the GPs, how we inspect, how we're looking to inspect children and babies and families, etc., really. And that will fit right into that and whatever, really. And I'm a real keen believer of how do we actually make that national bit really connect at a community and neighbourhood level, really. That's credit to Sue McMillan as well, really. Tons of stuff on, but actually saw the vision behind that, really. The other aspect, really, I'll just finish with, really. As you know, I co-chair the CQC's Equality Voices group, really. And we've decided in terms of our work plan, we're going to look at sectors. One of the sectors that I've opted for is the GP and primary care and whatever, really. And again, the vision of the person saying, well, we need to have a look at that. Would you actually like to come and be part of a session that we're running? Again, that's about the person seeing it. That's about the person, the vision. And more importantly, that's about actually saying, how do we connect that? So just those few points, if you like.
Well, Bren, thank you very much. I must say that when one's having a dark day in the office, to get a cheery email of support and encouragement from you is hugely, appreciated. And you're a constant reminder that we can there's a risk that we sit in an ivory tower here, and actually we must always look at how things play out on the ground. So I think I could certainly speak for most of my colleagues here, I think, who you're in communication with, just say how much we appreciate your words of encouragement and support. And I hope you'll join us for a sandwich and a cup of coffee now, Bren.
I will, David. And I wasn't being, sorry to finish, I wasn't being rude in terms, because I've read the papers and I've fed back to people. That was the plan B if 4:25 and I missed the coach and whatever, not 4:20. So there was always a plan B and whatever, really, for that. But the reason I wasn't, I was listening, but I wasn't, intent on everyone, really, it is because a small little community group are actually looking now to how do we really connect that work at the Cabinet Office. And I was just going through what they're putting in their proposals and whatever for that. And again, they're not people that have done the funding treadmill for 20-odd years and whatever. They've just stayed very, very low behind the radar, and day after day after day have delivered to some of the vulnerable people that we've talked around in the community and whatever, really. So that was just an apology to say I wasn't being rude, but that's got to go in quite quickly and whatever, and I need to support it. But thank you for allowing me to speak.
And will you give our kind regards and respect to Jan as well? I will, yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, Bram. Thank you. Oh.
Not on Bren's contribution, for which thanks also, but just a point of process. We've got a board forward plan which takes us to the next meeting, and I just would really appreciate if we could. But we've got a really clear work plan for the year. We know what the big things are that we'll need to have an airing both at kind of board workshops and at board meetings, and I know there are things that we have said we will have papers on at the board which still aren't on this list even for July. So the one that we rehearsed, where we're going to do in May, where we're going to do in June, and you weren't here in May and I wasn't here in June, and now it's not on the list at all. And so I worry that we're not capturing the things that we said we want to talk about, and that we don't have a clear sense of the things we need to talk about. So I just really like to ask for a forward plan for board workshops and public meetings for the rest of the year, consistent with what's in the work plan.